Dylan crossed his arms as he leaned against the counter of the refueling station's convenience store, watching the towering alien in front of him inspect a plastic-wrapped tray of sushi with something resembling curiosity. The alien, a Xelvani diplomat named Vritak, had an elongated, sinewy frame covered in smooth, dark blue skin. His 3 fingers delicately turned the package over, examining the contents as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "That is a terrible idea," Dylan said, shaking his head. Vritak's large black eyes flicked up. "Is this not food?" "Technically, yes," Dylan admitted, "but it's gas station sushi. You don't eat gas station sushi." Vritak tilted his head. "Humans consume these substances, yet you warn against them?" "Because humans make bad decisions all the time," Dylan said, "and then we suffer for it. Trust me, you do not want to experience food poisoning, especially if your species isn't used to human bacteria." Vritak tapped the plastic. "Xelvani digestive systems are highly adaptable." Dylan sighed. "That's what everyone says before they regret it." "Do you have any idea what happens when bad sushi hits your stomach?" Vritak blinked slowly. "No, it's not just nausea. It's full-body betrayal. Pain, vomiting, dehydration. You'll wish you could detach your own stomach and throw it into the nearest star." Vritak gave a dismissive wave of his long fingers. "Xelvani have advanced digestive resilience. I will consume this." Dylan held up both hands. "Hey, I warned you." Vritak placed the sushi onto the store's self-scanner, completing the transaction with a beep. Dylan watched as the alien unwrapped the plastic and popped a piece of raw fish into his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Vritak chewed, swallowed, and nodded. "The taste is adequate." Dylan sighed. "Give it time." 2 hours later, Dylan sat in the cockpit of his ship, reviewing fuel levels, when an urgent chime rang through the comms. He tapped the screen and Vritak's face appeared. His blue skin had taken on a sickly greenish hue. "You have poisoned me," Vritak croaked. Dylan groaned. "I told you not to eat it." "My insides are rebelling," Vritak wheezed. "My body temperature fluctuates. I am unwell." Dylan pulled up a map of the station's docking area. "Where are you?" "The diplomatic vessel," Vritak said weakly. Dylan grabbed his med kit and hurried to the Xelvani ship. As soon as the airlock cycled open, an overwhelming, foul stench hit him. He staggered back. "Ooh, no," Dylan muttered. The ship's interior was in chaos. Xelvani crew members moved frantically, their expressions a mix of alarm and disgust. The air was thick with the unmistakable smell of biological failure. Vritak was slumped against a wall, clutching his abdomen. His normally elegant posture was gone, replaced with the unmistakable hunch of someone in digestive agony. Dylan crouched beside him. "How bad?" Vritak groaned. "My internal waste processing systems are overwhelmed. The ship's sanitation filters are failing." Dylan glanced at the nearest ventilation grate. A worrying, gurgling noise echoed from within. He grimaced. "Your ship's sewage system isn't designed for this, is it?" Vritak shook his head weakly. A loud, wet gurgle came from the corridor, followed by a mechanical whine. Then a pipe burst. A thick, dark liquid sprayed across the floor. Xelvani crew members shouted in horror. Dylan swore. "Okay, we need to shut down your waste recycling before this turns into a full meltdown." Vritak shuddered. "I cannot move." Dylan grabbed his wrist. "Then tell me where the controls are." Vritak weakly pointed down the corridor. Dylan ran. The smell got worse. The ship's automated cleaning systems were clearly designed for normal waste levels, not the catastrophic failure currently unfolding. As he reached the recycling control panel, his boots made an unfortunate squelching sound. Dylan swallowed back his own nausea and tapped at the controls. The Xelvani interface was unfamiliar, but he recognized basic functions. He slammed the emergency override and diverted waste flow to an auxiliary tank. A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the ship. The immediate danger seemed to stabilize, but the damage was done. Dylan wiped sweat from his forehead and turned back to Vritak, who was still slumped against the wall. His breathing was uneven. "We need to get you to a medical bay," Dylan said. Vritak barely nodded. Dylan helped him up, half carrying the shaky alien toward the station's infirmary. Behind them, the Xelvani crew struggled to contain the damage. Vritak groaned. "You were correct," Dylan sighed. "Yeah, but that doesn't help you now." As they reached the infirmary doors, another emergency chime echoed through the station. Dylan turned his head toward the sound. The station's environmental alarms had triggered. This was getting worse. Dylan half-dragged Vritak through the infirmary doors as the station's environmental alarms blared. A frazzled-looking medic, a wiry woman with short-cropped hair, glanced up from her console with a deep frown. "What did you do?" she asked, barely masking her exasperation. "Not me," Dylan said. "Him. Bad Sushi." The medic's frown deepened as she approached. "I don't have time for food poisoning cases right now. The station's waste filtration system just flagged a critical contamination alert." Dylan shot Vritak a look. "Yeah, about that." Vritak, still hunched over, managed a weak wave of his fingers before groaning again. The medic's eyes darted between them, then narrowed. "You're telling me this is related?" Dylan exhaled. His ship's waste system couldn't handle the biological fallout. Some of it might have leaked. The medic pressed a hand to her forehead. "Great, just great." She grabbed a scanner and waved it over Vritak. The handheld device chirped, then displayed a rapidly scrolling list of unfamiliar biological readouts. The medic's frown turned into a full scowl. "This isn't just standard food poisoning," she muttered. "Whatever bacteria he picked up, it's running rampant in his system. His body's trying to fight it off, but it's not built for human-grade foodborne pathogens." Vritak made a pained noise, his skin taking on a slightly more pallid hue. "Your food is treacherous." Dylan shook his head. "I told you not to eat it." The medic ignored them both and tapped at her console. "I need to stabilize him before his system shuts down entirely, and we need to figure out what exactly is in his gut before it spreads beyond him." Dylan's stomach sank. "Spreads?" The medic shot him a sharp glance. His ship's waste system dumped partially processed organic matter into the station's filtration. If his body's hosting unfamiliar bacteria, it might already be circulating. Vritak groaned. Dylan resisted the urge to do the same. The medic grabbed an injector from a supply tray and pressed it against Vritak's arm. The device hissed as it delivered a dose of something that made the alien visibly relax, though his breathing remained uneven. "That should slow the worst of it," she said, "but I need a sample of whatever he ate." Dylan winced. "I really don't think you want that." "Doesn't matter what I want," the medic snapped. "If we don't figure this out now, the station's filtration might go into full lockdown. If that happens, we'll all be breathing contaminated air within hours." Vritak tried to straighten, but the movement sent a visible shudder through his frame. "This was not my intention." Dylan sighed. "Yeah, nobody intends to break a space station with bad sushi." The medic waved a hand. "No time for regrets. Dylan, go back to wherever he bought the food. I need to know exactly what was in it." Dylan hesitated, then nodded. "On it." With one last glance at Vritak, who looked like he was regretting every decision he'd ever made, Dylan turned and sprinted out of the infirmary. 15 minutes later, Dylan skidded back into the convenience store, breathless. The cashier, a bored-looking young man with dyed green hair, barely glanced up. "Back so soon?" Dylan slapped his hands on the counter. "The sushi, where did it come from?" The cashier raised an eyebrow. The refrigeration unit?" Dylan exhaled sharply. "No, I mean who supplied it." The cashier leaned back slightly. "Listen, man, it's just the same pre-packaged stuff we always get, comes in with the general shipments. Why?" Dylan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Because of Xelvani diplomat ate some, and now the station's waste system is on the verge of collapse." The cashier blinked. "Oh." Dylan leaned forward. "I need to know if there's anything weird about this batch." The cashier hesitated, then shrugged. "We did get a supply delay last cycle. Something about storage temperature fluctuations? But it cleared inspection, so..." Dylan groaned. You're telling me this stuff might have been sitting at the wrong temperature before getting sold? The cashier winced. Maybe. Dylan didn't wait for more details. He grabbed one of the remaining sushi packs from the refrigerated section, checked the label for distributor information, and bolted back toward the infirmary. By the time Dylan returned, the medic had hooked Vritak up to a monitoring system. The alien looked marginally better, but his breathing was still ragged. Dylan tossed the sushi pack onto the counter. It might have been stored at the wrong temperature before delivery. The medic snatched it up and scanned the label. That would explain the bacterial overgrowth. She tapped at her console. I'll run a culture test to confirm. Vritak gave a weak nod. I will never consume human food again. Dylan shook his head. Yeah, I think we all learned something today. The medic muttered something under her breath as she worked. After a few tense moments, her screen flashed with results. She frowned. Yep, contaminated, and the bacteria have already spread into the station's lower filtration levels. Dylan's stomach dropped. How bad? The medic glanced up. If we don't flush the system soon, we'll all be breathing fermented sushi air. Vritak groaned again. Dylan rubbed his temples. This was going to be a very, very long day. Dylan stood next to the medic's console, watching the screen display an alarming progression of contaminated filtration zones. The station's waste processing system had already flagged multiple sections for emergency containment, and if the spread continued, it would force a full lockdown of the environmental controls. Vritak, still lying on the infirmary cot, let out a strained breath. He looked marginally better after the stabilizing treatment, but the damage had been done. The medic tapped rapidly at her console. The station's filtration is designed to break down organic contaminants, but this is overwhelming the system. We need to flush it before it reaches upper circulation. Dylan rubbed his face. How do we do that? She gestured toward a blinking section on the screen. There's an auxiliary purge valve in the maintenance sector. If we manually trigger it, we can eject the contaminated waste before it cycles into the breathable air supply. Vritak made a faint noise of discomfort. My presence has created an environmental hazard. Dylan exhaled. Yeah, but let's focus on fixing it before everyone has to start wearing emergency respirators. The medic grabbed a portable filtration mask from a storage unit and tossed one to Dylan. You'll need this. If you're going into the maintenance sector, the air is already borderline toxic down there. Dylan caught it and secured it over his face. Great. Love that for me. He turned toward the exit. Where exactly am I going? The medic pointed to a section of the station map. Follow the lower access corridor. The control panel for the purge valve should be in the central junction. But be careful, if the waste pressure is unstable, you might have to override some safety protocols manually. Dylan gave a mock salute. Fantastic. Off to prevent the worst-smelling crisis in station history. Vritak shifted slightly, his expression still pained. I regret my choices. Dylan didn't slow his stride as he left the infirmary. Yeah, so does the station's air system. The maintenance sector was worse than Dylan had expected. The moment he stepped through the access hatch, the air grew thick with an unpleasant, organic stench that no filtration mask could fully block. The emergency lighting flickered, casting eerie shadows over the industrial piping that ran along the walls. He followed the station's guidance markers toward the central junction, where a reinforced control console stood next to a series of thick, waste processing conduits. A low, ominous gurgling sound echoed from the pipes, not a reassuring noise. Dylan approached the console and tapped at the interface. The system immediately flashed a warning. Containment breach imminent. Manual purge required. He muttered under his breath. Yeah, I figured. He scanned the options. The purge valve could be activated, but the system had flagged waste pressure as critically unstable. If he engaged the flush too quickly, it could rupture the conduits, turning an already bad situation into a catastrophic one. Dylan pressed the comm link on his wrist. I'm at the purge control, but there's a pressure issue. If I push this too fast, we might end up with a full system burst instead of a clean flush. The medic's voice crackled through. You'll have to release the pressure in stages. There should be manual vent valves along the adjacent conduits. Dylan turned his head, spotting a row of mechanical release levers along the wall. Got it. Give me a second. He moved quickly, gripping the first lever and pulling it downward. A loud hiss filled the space as the valve released, venting part of the built-up pressure. He hurried to the next, repeating the process. Each release made the gurgling sound in the pipes a little less aggressive, but the smell only intensified. When he reached the final valve, he braced himself before pulling it. This time, the pipes shuddered violently, and for a terrifying few seconds, he thought the system might rupture anyway. Then, with a deep, echoing groan, the pressure finally stabilized. Dylan rushed back to the console and activated the purge sequence. The system beeped in confirmation before a deep mechanical roar filled the space. The conduits trembled as they expelled the contaminated waste into an external processing chamber. A moment later, the warning lights flickered from red to yellow, then finally to a cautious green. Dylan exhaled heavily. "Tell me that worked." The medic's voice came through the comm. "Filtration readings are clearing up. You did it." Dylan leaned against the console, exhausted. "If I never have to do that again, it'll be too soon." Vritak's voice, still weak but clearer than before, crackled through the comm. "You have my deepest gratitude." Dylan shook his head, though they couldn't see him. "Just promise me you'll listen next time a human tells you not to eat something." Vritak let out a tired sigh. "I have learned my lesson." Dylan adjusted his mask and started making his way back. "Good, because if you ever do this again, I'm making you clean it up yourself." Dylan yanked off the filtration mask the moment he stepped back into the main corridor, sucking in clean, uncontaminated air with relief. His jumpsuit was beyond saving, the smell of the maintenance sector clinging to it like an insult. He made a mental note to burn it later. He tapped his comm. "Tell me everything's actually stable now." The medic's voice came through, laced with exhaustion. "Waste filtration readings are within safe parameters. No more risk of airborne contamination." Dylan rolled his shoulders, wincing at the stiffness creeping in. "And Vritak?" "He's recovering. His system took a hit, but he's stabilizing faster than I expected. I'd still keep him under observation for a little while, though." Dylan sighed. "Right. On my way." When he reached the infirmary, Vritak was propped up in the cot, looking significantly less like a creature on the verge of meeting an unfortunate end. His skin had regained some of its natural color, though he still looked drained. The medic stood nearby, arms crossed, watching a monitor displaying his vitals. Dylan pulled up a chair and dropped into it. "You owe me, big guy." Vritak's voice was rough but steady. "I acknowledge my miscalculation." The medic shook her head. "Miscalculation? Your decision nearly shut down a space station's entire environmental system." Vritak shifted uncomfortably. "A regrettable outcome." Dylan ran a hand down his face. "You're lucky it wasn't worse. If that bacteria had been more aggressive, we'd be dealing with an outbreak." Vritak inclined his head slightly. "I will ensure this experience is recorded for future diplomatic advisories." Dylan gave him a flat look. "That's the takeaway? A memo?" Vritak blinked. "It is crucial to prevent recurrence." The medic let out a tired laugh. "I think the takeaway should be, don't eat questionable human food in the first place." Vritak hesitated. "Human adaptability often leads to underestimation of potential hazards." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "You mean you assumed if we could eat it, you could too?" Vritak inclined his head. The medic scoffed. "That's some dangerous logic. You're built completely differently. Just because we survive our own bad decisions doesn't mean you will." Vritak exhaled slowly. "A lesson learned through experience." Dylan leaned back in his chair. "So what happens now? You still have a diplomatic meeting, don't you?" Vritak's expression darkened slightly. "Postponed. The station authorities require assurance that my actions will not lead to further complications." Dylan winced. "Yeah, that's fair." The medic tapped a few final notes into her console. "You'll be medically cleared in a few hours, but I'd recommend avoiding any further dietary risks." Vritak's face shifted into something resembling deep contemplation. I will exercise greater caution. Dylan smirked. Good, because if you ever do this again, I'm charging you for damages. Vritak nodded solemnly. A reasonable consequence. Dylan glanced at the medic. I need a shower and about 10 hours of sleep. She gave a dry chuckle. You and me both. Vritak observed them both for a moment before speaking again. Despite the ordeal, I appreciate the assistance. Your intervention prevented further crisis. Dylan snorted. Yeah, well, next time, just listen when someone tells you not to eat something. Vritak closed his eyes briefly, as if committing the lesson to memory. I will heed such warnings more carefully in the future. Dylan stood, stretching. Glad to hear it. The station had dodged a disaster, but Dylan had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time aliens underestimated human survival habits. At least now, one of them knew better. Dylan sat across from Vritak in the infirmary, arms crossed, exhaustion settling into his bones. The station was no longer on the verge of turning into a biological disaster zone, but the lingering consequences of the Xelvani's ill-advised meal were still unfolding. Vritak had regained some of his usual composure, though his posture remained stiff. A tray of nutrient gel sat untouched beside him, his expression unreadable as he glanced between it and Dylan. You appear fatigued, Vritak observed. Dylan let out a dry laugh. Yeah, running through the station trying to stop a sewage crisis will do that to you. Vritak inclined his head slightly. Your assistance was invaluable. Dylan rubbed his face. You know what would have been even more invaluable? If you'd listened in the first place. Vritak exhaled slowly. A failure in judgment. Dylan leaned forward. So what happens now? Because I'm guessing the station authorities aren't thrilled about any of this. Vritak's gaze flicked toward the door. They have requested a formal debrief. My crew is handling the diplomatic repercussions. Dylan raised an eyebrow. And you? Vritak hesitated before gesturing vaguely toward the medical equipment monitoring his vitals. Dylan shook his head. Right, because you're still recovering from your failure in judgment. Vritak glanced at the untouched nutrient tray. My body remains hesitant to accept sustenance. Dylan snorted. Yeah, well, I'd be hesitant too if my last meal nearly collapsed a space station. Vritak's expression remained neutral, but Dylan caught the slight tension in his jaw. The infirmary doors slid open and the medic stepped inside, holding a data pad. She looked between them, then focused on Vritak. Your vitals are stable, but I'd still recommend avoiding anything complex for at least another day. Vritak gave a small nod. Understood. Dylan gestured to the tray. He's not exactly excited about eating again. The medic crossed her arms. His body took a hit. It's normal to be wary after something like that. She tapped the data pad. But you do need to get something in your system soon. Vritak eyed the tray but made no move toward it. Dylan sighed. Look, I get it. Last time you ate, everything went spectacularly wrong, but this? He motioned to the nutrient paste. This won't do that. Vritak remained silent for a long moment before finally reaching for the tray. He lifted the spoon with deliberate care, taking a cautious bite. Dylan watched as Vritak swallowed, waiting for any sign of discomfort. The Xelvani diplomat closed his eyes briefly, then gave a slow nod. Acceptable, he murmured. Dylan leaned back. Progress. The medic shot him a look. Don't push him. He needs time to reset. Vritak placed the tray aside after only a few bites. I will proceed slowly. Dylan stood, stretching. Good. Because I have a feeling I'll be the one explaining all this to station security, and I'd prefer not to add alien diplomat refuses to eat to the list of problems. Vritak didn't argue. Dylan took that as a sign of wisdom finally settling in. For now, at least. Dylan rubbed his temples as he walked through the station's administrative wing, trailing behind two station security officers who had rather pointedly asked him to accompany them for a discussion. He wasn't technically in trouble, but he had the distinct feeling that explaining how a single Xelvani diplomat had nearly caused an environmental meltdown wasn't going to be fun. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered woman with sharp eyes, gestured for him to sit in a small, windowless briefing room. Across the table, a station administrator was already seated, tapping at a data pad with an expression that could only be described as deeply unamused. Dylan sat down, exhaling slowly. All right, let's get this over with. The administrator set the data pad down and folded his hands. You were involved in the containment efforts earlier today. Dylan nodded. Yeah, someone had to stop the filtration system from turning the entire station into a biohazard zone. The administrator's expression didn't shift. And you were also present when the Xelvani diplomat purchased the contaminated food item. Dylan leaned back slightly. I told him not to eat it. The officer beside him crossed her arms. He still did. Dylan shook his head. I can't physically stop a 7-foot alien from making a terrible decision. I warned him. Multiple times. The administrator sighed. And yet, here we are. Dylan ran a hand through his hair. Look, I get that this is embarrassing for the station. Nobody wants to be known as the place where an interspecies diplomat got taken down by bad sushi. But I did everything I could to prevent it, and I was the one knee-deep in the maintenance sector fixing the problem. The officer exchanged glances with the administrator, then tapped a control panel, bringing up a report on the wall display. The contamination was contained before it reached critical levels, but the damage to the Xelvani vessel's waste systems is still being assessed. Their engineers have filed a request for emergency repair resources. Dylan exhaled. So what does that mean for Vritak? The administrator tapped his fingers against the table. He's still under medical observation, but his government has assured us that no formal complaints will be filed. They're framing this as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than negligence. Dylan let out a short laugh. That's diplomatic phrasing for, they don't want to admit they made a mistake. The officer inclined her head slightly. The Xelvani value their image. A public incident like this isn't something they'd want to escalate. Dylan shrugged. Fine by me, as long as I don't have to deal with another crisis like this anytime soon. The administrator studied him for a moment. You've interacted with Vritak more than most. Do you believe he's learned from this experience? Dylan scoffed. Oh, he's learned all right. He looked like he was reconsidering his entire existence back in the infirmary. The officer gave a small nod. Good, because if we ever have another incident like this, I doubt the station leadership will be as forgiving. Dylan stood. Noted. Can I go now? The administrator waved him off. You're free to leave, but next time, if an alien diplomat is about to make a catastrophic mistake, maybe be a little more persuasive. Dylan shook his head, muttering as he left the room. Yeah, I'll just wrestle a 7-foot diplomat to the ground over a sushi tray. That'll go over well. Back in the infirmary, Vritak was sitting up properly, looking considerably more like himself. His posture was regaining its usual elegance, though there was still a trace of lingering exhaustion in his expression. Dylan dropped into a chair beside the cot. Good news. Station security isn't throwing you out for causing a biological emergency. Vritak gave a slow nod. A fortunate outcome. Dylan raised an eyebrow. I'd call it generous. The medic, standing nearby, crossed her arms. You're lucky your government handled things quietly. If this had escalated, the station could have banned Xelvani's ships from docking altogether. Vritak's expression tightened. Such consequences would have been regrettable. Dylan smirked. So, what's the plan now? You still have a diplomatic mission to finish, right? Vritak exhaled slowly. Once my condition is fully stabilized, I will proceed with my original agenda, though I suspect I will be subject to additional scrutiny. Dylan chuckled. Yeah, it turns out if you almost shut down a space station, people get a little wary. Vritak tilted his head slightly. A miscalculation I will not repeat. The medic stepped forward, scanning his vitals one last time. You're clear to leave, but take it easy for the next couple of days. No sudden dietary experiments. Vritak gave a formal nod. Understood. Dylan stood, stretching. Well, this has been an experience. Vritak considered him for a moment. Your assistance was invaluable. Dylan waved a hand. Yeah. Just do me a favor and don't make this a habit. Vritak's gaze was steady. It will not happen again. Dylan sighed. Good, because next time, I'm not saving you from your own bad decisions. Vritak inclined his head. A reasonable stance. Dylan shook his head as they exited the infirmary. You know, for a diplomat, you really didn't negotiate well with that Sushi. Vritak gave him a long look before responding. Some battles cannot be won. Dylan laughed. Yeah, and some meals shouldn't be eaten. As they walked away, the station's usual hum of activity surrounded them. The crisis was over. Lesson learned. And hopefully no other aliens would decide to test their resilience against human food anytime soon.